"You're just a burden now, Mom. Why don't you get that?" Those words echoed in my mind like a sharp echo in an empty room, whispered with such quiet cruelty that I could barely believe they came from my own son. He said it so low, so carefully, as if afraid someone else might overhear, as if I were some embarrassing secret he wished to hide away from the world. I'm 81 years old now, sitting in a small two-room flat above a quiet florist's shop, a space that smells faintly of fresh flowers and dust, where the walls hold neither family photographs nor memories, only the faint hum of the city below and the legal papers neatly stacked on my small wooden table. This is where I find myself, removed and invisible, yet strangely more aware than ever of who I am and what I have endured. For decades, I was the keeper of the hearth, the woman who baked the bread, mended the torn shirts, and held the family together when storms came. This house, once vibrant with laughter and the smell of cinnamon and fresh paint, was mine. It was more than bricks and mortar. It was the container of my life's work, the silent witness to birthdays, failures, and moments of quiet triumph. I paid the mortgage with my hard-earned savings, made sacrifices so my son could have a future brighter than mine. But somewhere along the way, the walls that once echoed with my voice became silent. My presence became a shadow, a disruption in the carefully curated life my son and his wife built. Now, in this flat above the florist, I live with the knowledge that the home I gave to them has been slowly, deliberately, transferred away from my name, away from my control, into the hands of a neighbor, a stranger I barely know. It's a cold realization to understand that those you nurtured and raised will one day look upon you as nothing more than a burden, a weight too heavy to bear, someone to be managed rather than loved. Daniel's voice still lingers in my ears, that quiet dismissal filled with the assumed righteousness of youth and entitlement. It was never said in anger or shouting, no dramatic confrontation. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the clinical precision of someone finalizing a business deal rather than speaking to their mother. The words cut deeper than any harshness shouted in the heat of an argument, because they revealed a truth I had refused to face, that I was no longer part of the family, but a problem to be solved, a relic to be packed away. When I arrived at their home a few months ago, it was under the pretense of a visit, of reconnecting. I carried with me a small suitcase, packed carefully with things I thought I might need, a few dresses, my knitting, a tin of raspberry scones, the recipe worn from years of baking. The house was beautiful, a showcase of modern taste and quiet luxury, but I was a stranger in it. There were no pictures of me, no signs that I belonged. The walls displayed perfectly framed art prints and photos of their friends and travels, but nothing from the past I shared with Daniel. The living room was impeccably tidy, the furniture arranged with deliberate symmetry, but it felt cold, a stage set without the warmth of history. I was shown to a small guest room down the hall, a space more suited to a hotel stay than a family home, with a crisp white bedspread and a lone chair against the wall. There was no place for my things, no corner to call my own. The days that followed were marked by polite indifference. Daniel and Carla moved through the house with an efficiency that made me feel invisible. Their conversations hushed when I entered the room. Their smiles were polite but distant. I realized quickly that I was expected to perform the role of a pleasant visitor rather than a mother or grandmother. When I tried to engage, to share stories from the past or ask about their lives, I was met with distracted nods or swift changes of subject. The message was clear. I was tolerated, but not truly welcome. My attempts to connect felt like I was speaking into a void. One afternoon, as I tidied the small room they had offered me, I found myself drawn to the pile of papers tucked away in a drawer. Among them was the original deed to the house, my name alone printed clearly as the legal owner. I had known it, but seeing it in my own hands was a bitter reminder of the shifting ground beneath my feet. For all their assurances, the house was still legally mine, at least on paper. But the reality felt far different. The house I had nurtured, the home I had paid for, was no longer a place where I belonged. Daniel had become distant, a man who now seemed more concerned with appearances and control than with the family ties we once shared. I overheard conversations in hushed tones, Daniel and Carla speaking of next steps, of assisted living options and legal arrangements. I heard the word quietly repeated often, as if I were a delicate problem to be managed with discretion, rather than a person to be consulted. There was talk of selling the house or transferring ownership, all without my consent or involvement. The final straw came when Carla casually mentioned to me, as if it were a kindness, that it might be simpler if I didn't talk about the ownership to anyone, especially the neighbors. I nodded, though inside I felt the sharp sting of erasure. The house, once filled with the sounds of my children's laughter and the warmth of family gatherings, now seemed to exist in a parallel world, a life that continued without me. The garden was perfectly manicured, but the roses I planted years ago were gone. The kitchen gleamed with new appliances, but I was no longer the one who prepared the meals. It was as though I had been airbrushed out of the family portrait. Each day, the sense of displacement grew heavier. I walked through the rooms as a ghost might wander a forgotten house, touching surfaces that no longer held memories, listening for echoes of a past that had slipped through my fingers. I found myself retreating into silence, hiding the hurt behind a polite smile. It was easier to be invisible than to confront the cold reality that the people I loved most no longer saw me as family. But beneath the quiet resignation, something began to stir. The discovery of the deed in that drawer sparked a quiet determination. If the house was legally mine, then so was the power to decide its future. I reached out to an old neighbor, June, a woman I had once helped during a difficult time, and she answered my call with kindness and steady support. With her encouragement, I sought legal advice and learned about my rights, about how I could reclaim some control in this situation that felt like it was spinning out of my grasp. The path forward was not easy. Daniel was not pleased when he discovered my inquiries. There were angry words, veiled threats, and emotional manipulation. But I held firm. With June's help, I navigated the complicated legal process to quietly transfer the ownership of the house to her name. Someone I trusted deeply, someone who had been a true friend when I needed one most. This act was not born of revenge, but of survival and dignity. By transferring the house, I reclaimed my sense of agency, creating a buffer between myself and the family that no longer respected me. It was a painful but necessary cut, a way to say, I will not be your burden any longer, nor your possession to control. The neighbor's name on the deed was a symbol of a new beginning, a protection from the past. Now in this small flat above the florist's shop, I have found a measure of peace. The walls may not be adorned with family portraits, but they hold the quiet strength of a woman who has refused to be erased. I bake banana bread sometimes and bring half to June, sharing warmth without expectation. I write letters to myself, reminders that I am not invisible, that I am not a burden but the backbone of a family that simply forgot to stand upright. The house is gone, but my spirit remains unbroken, and for the first time in many years, I feel like I belong, to myself, to a life I have chosen. The moment everything changed was not marked by thunderous arguments or a sudden outburst, but rather by the quiet and calculated way Daniel and Carla orchestrated what they called a family meeting, a phrase that, in retrospect, felt more like a verdict than a gathering. I had come to their home hoping to reconnect, to share a cup of tea and perhaps to find some warmth amid the growing distance between us. But instead I found myself sitting in a sterile dining room that looked like it belonged in a showroom, surrounded by people who spoke to me not as a mother or grandmother, but as a problem to be managed. It began with a brochure that Carla placed gently in front of me, glossy pages filled with pictures of assisted living facilities that promised comfort, care, and community. The words were carefully chosen, but the message was clear. It was time for me to move on from the house I had built and the life I had lived. Daniel spoke softly, too softly for the weight of what he was saying, about safety concerns and making things easier for everyone. But there was an undercurrent of impatience beneath his calm tone. He kept glancing at his phone, checking messages, or perhaps waiting for a signal, as if this conversation was just a formality before the real decisions were made elsewhere. I remember how Carla's eyes darted around the room, calculating, and how she squeezed my hand once, a gesture that was both condescending and rehearsed, like a sympathy card signed in advance. They presented me with a calendar filled with appointments for medical assessments and suggested times to tour facilities, implying that these plans were for my benefit, but giving me no real choice. It was as if they were deciding my future behind a curtain and inviting me to applaud the curtain call. The betrayal did not come in the form of harsh words, but in the way they spoke about me when they thought I wasn't listening, the way their smiles didn't reach their eyes when they looked at me, and most cruelly, in the quiet whispers that reached my ears through the walls, their discussions about fast-tracking the paperwork and ensuring the house is transferred before she gets any ideas. I realized then that they did not see me as a mother, a woman who had given everything, but as an obstacle, to be removed, a piece of inconvenient property to be dealt with quietly and efficiently. One afternoon, as I sat in the guest room that felt more like a cage than a refuge, I overheard Daniel on the phone, speaking in hushed tones but with unmistakable firmness. "Yes, I've got everything lined up. The papers are ready to go. She won't know what hit her." The call ended with a curt, "Thanks," and a sigh that sounded more like relief than affection. That moment crystallized everything I had been trying to deny. The family I thought I had was a carefully constructed illusion, and I was nothing more than a burden they wished to shed. The next days were filled with a strange kind of loneliness, one sharpened by the presence of people who were physically close but emotionally distant. Carla's attempts at conversation felt like rehearsed lines from a play, and Daniel's silence was colder than any words. At the dinner table, they talked about future plans, vacations they intended to take without me, and investments in properties I would never see. I was there but not there, a ghost haunting the edges of their lives. The cruelty was subtle and insidious. I found my belongings being moved without my consent, my favorite chair replaced with a sleek modern recliner that I did not want. The temperature in the house lowered to a chill that made my joints ache. I was given a schedule of meals and activities designed not for my comfort but for their convenience. My presence was tolerated but not welcomed. I was a guest who had overstayed her welcome, a visitor in what had once been my home. One morning, Daniel handed me a stack of papers with a practiced smile and said, "These are just some formalities to help us move forward. Nothing to worry about." The documents were complicated, filled with legal jargon that made my head spin. But one word stood out clearly: transfer. The house, my home, the place where I had lived for over 40 years, was being quietly wrested away from me. I asked questions, but Daniel's answers were vague and dismissive, his patience thinning with each inquiry. "It's for the best," he said. "We're just trying to protect you." It was not the first time I had been told what was best for me, but this time the words felt like a sentence, a final judgment passed without trial. I realized that the future they had planned did not include me, except as a quiet shadow, a problem to be managed until I was no longer a concern. The realization was a shock that sent waves through my heart and mind, a betrayal so profound because it came not with violence, but with silence, with absence, with a slow erasure. The turning point came when I found a letter slipped under my door, unsigned but unmistakably from Carla. It was a note of concern about my health, warning me of the dangers of living alone and urging me to cooperate with their plans. The tone was sweet, almost tender, but the words felt like chains wrapped around my freedom. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my purse, a small act of defiance against the inevitability they sought to impose. Despite the mounting pressure, I refused to give in quietly. I began to reach out to old friends, to gather information, to understand the legalities they assumed I did not grasp. The realization that I still held the deed to the house was a lifeline thrown to me in a sea of despair. It reminded me that while they tried to erase my presence, I still had the power to reclaim my story. The catalyst for change was not a grand rebellion, but a quiet awakening, a decision made in the solitude of my room late at night, when the house was dark and the world outside was asleep. I understood that if I did not act, I would be erased, not just from the house but from my own life. I made a promise to myself that I would fight, not with anger or bitterness, but with calm determination and clarity. Daniel and Carla's plans would not unfold as they intended. Their carefully laid schemes, their whispered meetings, and their staged concern would meet the quiet strength of a woman who refused to be diminished. The battle lines were drawn not in shouting matches or courtroom dramas, but in the small acts of gathering information, seeking allies, and quietly preparing to reclaim what was rightfully mine. This moment, this realization that I was being pushed out and erased, became the turning point in my life. It was the moment when the roles shifted, from a woman controlled and diminished to one who quietly seized control of her own fate. The catalyst was painful, bitter, and filled with a sense of loss, but it was also the spark that ignited a new journey, a journey toward reclaiming dignity, agency, and the right to be seen as more than a burden. Looking back, I see that the catalyst was never about the house itself. The house was a symbol, a battleground where love, betrayal, and survival played out in silent battles and whispered words. What was truly at stake was my identity, my worth, and my refusal to be invisible. Daniel and Carla may have thought they were protecting me, but they were only revealing the fractures in a family that had forgotten the meaning of belonging. And so, with the weight of that catalyst heavy on my shoulders, I began the slow, deliberate work of reclaiming my life piece by piece, starting with the house that was mine, the memories I refused to let go, and the quiet strength that no one could take away. After the initial shock of realizing that the people I had loved and sacrificed for were now quietly plotting to erase me from the life I once shared with them, the days that followed settled into a slow, suffocating pattern. The betrayal did not come with sudden upheaval or dramatic confrontation, but with the subtle, relentless erosion of my place in the world I had helped build. I found myself navigating a new reality where every small detail, every minor change, whispered that I was no longer welcome, that my presence was no longer desired. It was as if the house itself, which had once been my sanctuary, had turned its back on me, becoming a stage for a carefully choreographed displacement. The mornings began with a growing sense of disquiet as I wandered through rooms that felt less and less like home. The furniture seemed unfamiliar, as though it had been rearranged by invisible hands seeking to disorient me, to remind me that this space was no longer mine to command. My favorite chair, worn soft by years of reading and reflection, had been replaced with a sleek modern recliner, its synthetic fabric cold against my skin, a silent statement of change. The familiar warmth of the kitchen was replaced by the sterile gleam of new appliances I neither asked for nor recognized, and the scent of fresh flowers and old books gave way to the faint, impersonal aroma of cleaning products. I began to notice the small but significant ways in which my autonomy was being chipped away. The thermostat was adjusted without consultation, lowering the temperature in the house to a chill that gnawed at my bones and reminded me that I was no longer in control of my own comfort. Meals were planned and prepared according to schedules and diets I had no say in, portions measured and divided in a way that left me feeling like a child being managed rather than an adult deserving respect. When I asked to keep my favorite tea, they replaced it with a brand I didn't like, telling me it was healthier, more suitable for someone my age. The unspoken message was always the same. You are no longer the person who makes decisions here. Conversations with Daniel and Carla became exercises in patience and invisibility. Their words were clipped and purposeful, often addressed to each other rather than to me, as if I were a bystander in my own life. Daniel's laughter, once warm and familiar, now held an edge of impatience or avoidance, while Carla's smiles seemed rehearsed, her eyes darting away when I tried to meet their gaze. Invitations to join family gatherings or outings were scarce, and always accompanied by caveats or apologies that felt more like excuses to keep me at arm's length. I was a visitor in the house, not a resident, a guest expected to be seen but not heard. One afternoon, I found myself alone in the garden, a place where I had once spent countless hours tending roses and planting bulbs for spring. The soil, once soft beneath my fingers, had been replaced with freshly laid gravel and perfectly trimmed hedges. The wildness I loved smoothed away in favor of order and control. I ran my hand over the rough surface of a stone bench, its coldness matching the growing distance I felt inside. Memories flooded back. Childhood picnics, family celebrations, quiet afternoons spent knitting, now overshadowed by the weight of being pushed aside. The subtle exclusions extended beyond the physical. I began to notice the way their friends and acquaintances treated me. The polite but fleeting greetings, the averted eyes, the hushed whispers as I passed. At social gatherings, I became an observer, sitting quietly at the edge of conversations where my name was seldom spoken. It was as if I had become a ghost, haunting their carefully constructed lives, present but unseen, acknowledged but disregarded. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast long shadows across the living room, I overheard a conversation between Daniel and Carla that made my heart sink deeper into despair. They spoke of finalizing the paperwork and making sure everything is in order before she realizes what's happening. Their voices were low, conspiratorial, but the intentions were clear. They viewed me not as a mother or a woman deserving of dignity, but as an obstacle to be removed with as little fuss as possible. I felt the walls closing in, the air thick with unspoken judgments and hidden agendas. The house that had once been filled with laughter and love now echoed with the silence of erasure. I was becoming a stranger in my own life, a relic to be discarded in the name of progress and convenience. The small kindnesses I once received, the gentle touch on the arm, the shared cup of tea, the spontaneous smile, were replaced by calculated gestures designed to placate without truly caring. Despite the mounting pressure and the creeping isolation, I refused to let despair take hold. I clung to the fragments of my identity that remained untouched. The memories, the quiet strength forged through years of hardship, the knowledge that I still held the deed to the house in my hands. This legal paper became a symbol of resistance, a reminder that while my place in the family was being challenged, I had not yet lost myself. The process of exclusion reached a new level when I was presented with documents to sign, legal papers that, on the surface, appeared to be simple formalities but carried the weight of a quiet dispossession. I sat at the kitchen table, the papers spread before me like a puzzle I was meant to solve without all the pieces. The language was dense and confusing, filled with terms I had to look up, and the implications were stark. They wanted me to relinquish control, to surrender the last vestiges of my claim to the home I had loved. Daniel's insistence was polite but firm, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Mom, this is for your own good," he said. "We're just trying to make sure you're safe and comfortable." But his words felt hollow, a thin veil over the cold reality that this was about control, about finalizing a plan that excluded me. When I hesitated, his patience wore thin, and I saw the frustration flicker behind his eyes. A frustration, not with me, but with the obstacle I represented. In those moments, I felt a profound loneliness, a sense of being caught between worlds, the past I cherished, and the present I was being pushed out of. The familiar rhythms of family life had shifted, replaced by a silent struggle for agency and respect. I was no longer the woman who shaped a home. I was the woman being shaped by forces beyond my control. Yet even as the days darkened with exclusion and quiet hostility, a flicker of resolve grew within me. I began to speak less, listen more, and observe the subtle patterns of their actions. I reached out to old friends, to neighbors who had witnessed the life I had built, and who remembered me not as a burden but as a woman of strength and kindness. Their quiet support became a lifeline, a reminder that I was not alone. The house, once a symbol of security and belonging, had become a battleground of wills. Every small act of exclusion, every whispered conversation, every change made without my consent was a reminder of the shifting power dynamic. But it was also a call to action. I realized that if I did not assert myself, if I did not reclaim my voice and my rights, I would be lost not only in their plans but in my own story. The first escalation was not dramatic or violent, but it was relentless and devastating in its quiet cruelty. It was the slow erasure of a lifetime of love and sacrifice, replaced by the cold calculus of convenience and control. But within that escalation, I found a spark of defiance, a determination to fight for my dignity and my place in the world. The path ahead would be difficult and uncertain, but it was mine to choose. In the end, the house was more than a building. It was a symbol of my identity, my history, and my connection to those I loved. And as the walls seemed to close in, as the familiar spaces became strange, I made a silent vow to reclaim what was mine. Not just the house, but my life, my dignity, and my right to be seen and heard. The first escalation was a beginning, a challenge that would test my strength and resolve, but it would not be my end. In the midst of the growing silence that had settled over my life, a small but significant shift began to take root, a quiet stirring that gradually awakened something inside me I thought had been lost forever. It wasn't marked by grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but by a series of subtle moments that slowly reclaimed my sense of self and planted the seeds for a new path forward. This shift started with the simple act of seeking help from an old friend, a neighbor named June, whose kindness came as a balm to my bruised spirit, and whose steady presence reminded me that I was not as alone as I had come to believe. June was someone I had helped years ago, a woman who had faced her own battles and emerged with a resilience that I admired deeply. When I reached out to her in the quiet desperation of those early days, her response was immediate and without judgment. She didn't ask for explanations or excuses. She simply listened, offering a hand and a warm smile that said, "You are seen. You matter." It was in her modest kitchen, surrounded by the scent of brewing tea and the gentle hum of her radio, that I first allowed myself to speak openly about the pain and confusion that had shadowed my days. Together, we sifted through the tangled web of my situation, piecing together what I knew and what I needed to learn. June introduced me to the language of legal rights and protections, helping me understand that the papers I had been handed were not just documents, but tools that could be wielded for both harm and protection. She guided me toward an old friend of hers, a lawyer who specialized in elder law and who saw beyond the surface of my predicament to the core of what I was fighting for: dignity, respect, and the right to remain the author of my own story. The days that followed were filled with research, meetings, and quiet determination. I pored over books and pamphlets, took notes on legal jargon that once seemed impenetrable, and slowly, piece by piece, began to assemble a plan. It was a humbling experience, confronting the reality that I had to fight not just for a house, but for my very identity in the eyes of my own family and society. Yet in this process, I found a surprising strength, a resilience forged through decades of hardship and love, now repurposed for a new battle. One afternoon, As I sat in June's sunlit living room, sipping the chamomile tea she had brewed, I pulled out the deed to the house and studied it carefully. My name was there, clear and unambiguous, a testament to the years of work and sacrifice that had built the foundation not just of a home, but of a family legacy. That piece of paper, once a source of quiet pride, had become a symbol of hope and possibility. It reminded me that while I had been sidelined, I still held the means to reclaim my power. The shift was not only practical, but deeply emotional. I began to reconnect with the parts of myself that had been hidden away. The woman who loved gardening, who wrote poetry in the margins of old notebooks, who found joy in the small, quiet moments of life. I started keeping a journal, filling the pages with memories and reflections, anger and hope. Writing became a lifeline, a way to articulate the complexities of my feelings and to remind myself that I was still here, still whole, still capable of growth. June's visits became a lifeline. She didn't ask me to hurry or to resolve everything at once. She simply sat with me, shared meals, and offered the steady companionship that had been missing for so long. We talked about everything and nothing, family, books, the changing seasons. And in those conversations, I found a new sense of belonging. It was a belonging not tied to blood or property, but to friendship and mutual respect. A reminder that family can be chosen as well as given. With June's encouragement, I began to imagine a future beyond the shadow of my son's plans, a future where I could live with dignity and autonomy on my own terms. It was not an easy vision to hold, especially in the face of ongoing pressure and the quiet but persistent feeling of being pushed out. But the act of imagining, of daring to hope for something better, was itself a radical act of resistance. In the midst of this emotional and practical awakening, I also took a small but powerful symbolic step. I began to care for a small garden patch outside my temporary home. The act of planting seeds and watching them grow became a metaphor for my own journey, a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, life can take root and flourish. Tending to the soil, nurturing the fragile shoots, I found a renewed connection to the rhythms of the earth and a grounding presence that steadied me. This midpoint shift was not a sudden turning point, but a gradual unfolding, a quiet reclaiming of agency and hope in the face of loss and betrayal. It marked the beginning of a new chapter in my life, one where I no longer waited passively for others to decide my fate, but took deliberate steps toward reclaiming my voice and my place in the world. I knew the road ahead would be difficult and uncertain, fraught with challenges and setbacks, but for the first time in many months, I felt a flicker of light within the darkness. It was the light of possibility, of choice, and of the quiet but unyielding strength that comes from standing up for oneself. This shift was not just about the house or the legal battles to come. It was about reclaiming my identity, my dignity, and the simple human right to be seen and respected. It was a reminder that no matter how deep the wounds, no matter how strong the forces of exclusion, there is always a path forward, sometimes found in the unexpected kindness of a neighbor, the wisdom of an old friend, or the steady growth of a garden in bloom. And so, with the support of June, the guidance of a trusted lawyer, and the quiet courage I had rediscovered within myself, I began to walk that path, one step at a time, with a heart both wary and hopeful. The midpoint of my journey was not an end but a beginning, a turning toward a future I would choose for myself, a future where I was no longer invisible but alive and whole. The fragile sense of control I had begun to reclaim was soon tested in ways I could not have anticipated, as the past I had tried to move beyond pressed in with renewed intensity. The days of quiet reflection and careful planning gave way to a series of confrontations and pressures that shook me to my core, forcing me to face not only the forces aligned against me, but the deeper wounds left by years of neglect and dismissal. It was a time when the battle for my dignity and independence became painfully visible, both in the cold legal maneuvers and the raw emotional currents that surged beneath the surface. It began one gray morning when the mail arrived heavier than usual, a stack of letters and notices that carried with them the weight of escalation. Among them was a letter from my son Daniel, its tone clipped and formal, carefully crafted to sound concerned yet unmistakably authoritative. He accused me of making unilateral decisions and disrupting family harmony, phrases that felt like veiled accusations rather than attempts at dialogue. His words echoed the old scripts of control and dismissal, reminding me that to him, I was still a problem to be managed rather than a person to be respected. Alongside Daniel's letter were documents from a lawyer, a representative he had hired, demanding I cease any legal action regarding the house and threatening consequences if I did not comply. The message was clear. They would not back down, and neither would I. The arrival of these letters marked the beginning of what I came to think of as the second escalation, a period defined not only by legal pressure, but by emotional tests and confrontations that cut deeply. Daniel called more frequently, his voice tight and sharp, demanding explanations and trying to coax me into submission with promises that sounded hollow. Carla, once more the face of gentle persuasion, sent messages laced with guilt and warnings about the stress I was causing the family. Their combined efforts were relentless, designed to wear me down through constant reminders that I was an inconvenience, a source of worry, and a threat to their carefully maintained lives. One afternoon, the tension reached a new height when Daniel showed up unannounced at June's house, where I had been staying for the past weeks. His arrival was abrupt, his presence commanding and uncomfortable. He spoke in measured tones, attempting to mask the anger simmering beneath. He accused me of betrayal, of fracturing the family for my own pride, and demanded I reconsider my actions. "Mom," he said, "we only want what's best for you. You're making this harder than it needs to be." His words felt like knives disguised as concern. I listened quietly, the years of frustration and hurt pooling beneath my skin. But I did not respond with anger. Instead, I spoke calmly, firmly, telling him that my decisions were not made lightly and that I sought only respect and dignity. He left without another word, but the encounter left a cold imprint on my heart. The emotional weight of the escalation was compounded by moments of painful revelation. Old family friends began to reach out with cautious sympathy, offering support but also reminders of the distance that had grown between us. June stood steadfast beside me, her quiet presence a source of strength, but even her encouragement could not fully shield me from the sting of isolation. I found myself grappling with waves of loneliness, haunted by memories of what had been and what was slipping away. In the midst of this turmoil, I received a letter from my grandson, Kieran, a young man whose gentle spirit had always been a balm to my soul. His words were filled with concern and hope, a reminder that not all ties had frayed beyond repair. He wrote of his longing to understand, to bridge the gap between us, and to stand by me in a world that often seemed cold and unwelcoming. His letter arrived like a ray of light in the dark, and though I was wary of opening my heart fully again, I held on to the possibility of reconciliation on my own terms. Meanwhile, the legal battle continued to escalate. The lawyer Daniel had hired sent increasingly urgent letters, demanding immediate cessation of any claims or transfers related to the house. There were veiled threats of litigation and suggestions that my actions were causing undue hardship to the family. I responded with measured calm, consulting with the attorney June had recommended, crafting replies that asserted my rights and my intent to protect what was rightfully mine. The exchange was exhausting and fraught with tension, a reminder that this was not just a personal fight, but a legal and financial struggle with far-reaching implications. Amid the pressure, a surprising development came from an unexpected corner. The neighbor to whom I had transferred the house, a woman named Marion, became an unexpected ally. She had watched the unfolding drama with quiet concern and offered to act as a shield and advocate on my behalf. Marion's steadfast support was a source of comfort and practical assistance, reminding me that even in the darkest times, human kindness could break through the hardest walls. Together, we navigated meetings with lawyers and officials, pushing back against the attempts to undermine my decisions and protect the home that symbolized more than just property. It was my legacy and my sanctuary. The social ramifications of the escalation were no less profound. At community gatherings and casual encounters, I sensed the shifting attitudes of those around me. Some offered tentative support, others withdrew, wary of the controversy that had become public knowledge. Rumors began to circulate, painting me as a difficult or stubborn figure, a portrayal that felt both unfair and deeply painful. Yet I refused to let these whispers define me. I held fast to the truth of my experience, finding strength in the clarity of my own convictions. The emotional toll of the second escalation was immense. There were nights when sleep eluded me, the weight of the conflict pressing heavily on my chest. I grappled with feelings of grief and anger, frustration and sorrow. But amidst the storm, I found moments of clarity and resolve. I understood that this struggle was not simply about a house or legal ownership. It was about reclaiming my voice, my dignity, and my right to exist on my own terms. In those dark hours, I reflected on the years that had brought me here, the sacrifices made, the love given, and the years of being seen as less than whole. I realized that this escalation was not an end but a crucible, a testing ground where my resilience would be forged anew. The pressures and confrontations, though painful, were revealing the strength I had cultivated over a lifetime and the clarity of purpose that now guided me. With each challenge, I grew more determined to see this journey through. I sought out moments of peace where I could replenish my spirit, quiet walks in the garden, time spent with June and Marion, the simple pleasure of tending to my small patch of earth. These moments grounded me, reminding me that despite the turbulence, I was still here, still capable of love and hope and healing. The second escalation was a period of intense testing, a time when the past pressed hard against the present, demanding answers and forcing choices. It revealed the fractures in relationships and the raw edges of pain, but also illuminated the path forward. It was a chapter marked by struggle and confrontation, but also by the quiet, steadfast courage that had carried me through so much before. As the days passed and the battle continued, I held on to the hope that one day the wounds would heal, that bridges could be rebuilt, and that I could find a way to live with peace and dignity. The road was uncertain and fraught with difficulty, but I knew that surrender was not an option. This escalation, with all its trials, was shaping me into a woman who would no longer be defined by others' perceptions, but by her own strength and truth. In the end, the second escalation was not merely a clash of wills, but a profound reckoning with what it meant to be seen, to be heard, and to be respected. It was a time of loss and confrontation, but also a time of awakening and assertion. And through it all, I learned that even in the face of deep betrayal, the human spirit can find ways to endure, to resist, and ultimately, to reclaim what is rightfully its own. The moment of culmination arrived not with fireworks or grand declarations, but with the quiet, deliberate act of reclaiming what had always been mine, a gesture that spoke louder than any words ever could. It was a decision made after long nights of wrestling with fear and doubt, after days weighed down by confrontation and emotional strain, a decision that marked the irreversible turning point in my journey from invisibility to agency. The house that had once been a battleground became the stage for my final assertion of dignity and control, a place where I would no longer be a pawn, but the author of my own story. With June by my side, steady and unwavering, I walked into the lawyer's office, a small nondescript room filled with stacks of papers and the muted hum of a copier. The air was heavy with anticipation, and the weight of years compressed into this one moment. The lawyer, a professional with kind eyes but firm resolve, laid out the documents on the polished wooden table. These papers were more than legal formalities. They were a declaration of my autonomy, a shield against the attempts to diminish me. I took the pen with hands that trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from the enormity of the act I was about to undertake. The transfer of ownership to my neighbor Marion was a calculated and carefully chosen step. Marion was not merely a name on a deed. She was a trusted friend, someone who had stood by me when others turned away, a woman whose quiet strength mirrored my own. By placing the house in her name, I was not relinquishing my legacy but safeguarding it from those who sought to erase it. It was an act of preservation, of love for the life I had built, and the memories etched into every corner of those walls. As I signed the documents, the finality of the moment settled over me like a heavy cloak. This was not a surrender, but a reclaiming, a way of saying that I would no longer be controlled or defined by the narrow perceptions of others. The lawyer's voice was calm as he explained the legal implications, but I hardly heard the words. My mind was filled with the images of a life I was determined to protect in whatever form it might now take. The papers were signed, sealed, and delivered, and with that the house belonged to Marion. But my connection to it, my sense of ownership and belonging, remained unbroken. Returning home that day, the house felt different, lighter somehow, as if the burden of conflict had been lifted. Marion was waiting on the porch, a small smile on her face, her hands warm and steady as she took the keys from me. She promised to care for the house with the same love and respect I had given it, a promise that comforted me more than I expected. This was more than a transaction. It was a transfer of trust, a bond forged in quiet solidarity. The legal battle that had threatened to consume me gradually receded into the background, replaced by a new reality defined by choice and freedom. The house was no longer a source of conflict, but a symbol of resilience, a testament to the power of reclaiming one's life on one's own terms. I found myself breathing easier, the constant tension easing as the final pieces fell into place. The threats and letters from the lawyer became distant echoes, powerless against the certainty of my decision. In the weeks that followed, I moved into a small flat above a florist's shop, a place that smelled of fresh blooms and new beginnings. It was modest but warm, filled with the gentle light of morning and the quiet hum of life unfolding at its own pace. Here, I began to rebuild, not just my living space, but my sense of self and belonging. The flat became a sanctuary, where I could nurture my own needs and desires, free from the expectations and judgments that had once weighed me down. One of the most profound moments of the climax was the letter I wrote to the lawyer, Derek Sorensen, Daniel and Carla's representative. It was brief but firm, a clear statement that any further attempts to interfere in my life would be considered harassment. I sent it without hesitation, feeling a sense of closure wash over me. This letter was not written in anger but in calm resolve, a declaration that I was no longer willing to be pushed, prodded, or diminished. The legal world, which had once seemed impenetrable and daunting, had become a tool in my hands. The response was silence, and in that silence, I found peace. The house was safe, my boundaries respected, and I was free to live according to my own terms. This victory was not just legal but deeply personal, a reclaiming of voice and power that had been denied to me for so long. It was a moment of transformation, a bridge between the past and the future, and a testament to the strength that can be found even in the most difficult circumstances. At home, the support of Marion and June became invaluable. Marion's gentle presence and practical help eased the transition, while June's companionship offered emotional sustenance. Together they formed a circle of care and friendship that reminded me that family can be found in unexpected places and that true belonging is built on respect and kindness. The climax was also marked by small symbolic acts that affirmed my renewed agency. I bought myself a warm coat, a simple navy wool piece that fit like a promise of protection and dignity. I took pleasure in choosing my own groceries, preparing meals according to my taste, and setting my own schedule. These everyday acts, once taken for granted, became affirmations of my right to live fully and freely. One evening, as I sat by the window watching the fading light, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here, the betrayals, the quiet humiliations, the moments of doubt, and the growing strength that had carried me through. I understood that this climax was not an end but a new beginning, a chapter where I would write my own story without apology or fear. In the quiet of that moment, I also thought of my son and his wife, not with bitterness, but with a sober understanding of the complex human emotions that had shaped our fractured relationships. I knew healing would not come quickly, if at all, but I was no longer defined by their acceptance or rejection. I was defined by the choices I had made, the dignity I had reclaimed, and the life I was determined to live. The climax of this journey was a testament to the power of quiet courage and deliberate action. It was a reminder that even in the face of profound betrayal, one can find a path to freedom and self-respect. It was a victory not just of legal rights, but of human spirit, a declaration that no one has the right to diminish another's worth or erase their existence. As the days turned into weeks, I settled into this new life with a calm confidence. The house I once owned was no longer a source of conflict, but a memory preserved with care and love. I was no longer a shadow on the edges of others' lives, but a woman standing firmly in her own light. The climax had brought me full circle, from invisibility to presence, from silence to voice, from burden to woman of strength. And in that presence, I found peace. The quiet that settled over my life after the storm of conflict was not emptiness, but a kind of peace I had not known for many years. It was the gentle, steady kind of peace that comes not from forgetting the pain or pretending the wounds don't exist, but from the acceptance of what has been and the embrace of what remains. In my small flat above the florist's shop, surrounded by the soft scent of flowers and the calm hum of everyday life, I found a space where I could finally breathe freely and begin to heal. The house I had once owned was no longer mine in any legal sense, yet it lived in my heart as a sanctuary of memories, a testament to the years I had poured into building a family and a home. Its walls held echoes of laughter, tears, and moments of quiet joy, and though I had passed the keys to Marion, I knew that the spirit of the place endured. That knowledge brought me a quiet comfort, a reminder that some things, no matter how deeply challenged, remain untouched by time or circumstance. Life in the flat was simpler, smaller, but it was mine. I arranged the furniture with care, placed old photographs on the windowsill, and filled the shelves with books and mementos that told the story of my life. I baked banana bread on Sunday mornings, a ritual that connected me to the past even as I looked forward. Half of the bread I always took to June's house, sharing warmth and kindness that had been a lifeline through the darkest days. Our friendship, born in the soil of shared experience and quiet understanding, grew stronger with each passing week. The days were slower now, but they were filled with moments of meaning. I took long walks through the neighborhood, greeting familiar faces and meeting new ones. The florist below became a place of refuge, where the beauty of blooms softened the edges of my memories and opened my heart to new possibilities. I found joy in the simple act of tending to a small windowsill garden, watching life grow and change with the seasons, a mirror to my own journey of renewal. Writing became a daily practice, a way to untangle the threads of my thoughts and emotions. I penned letters, not always sent, to my son and daughter-in-law, not with anger or blame, but with honesty and a longing for understanding. I wrote to myself as well, reminders that I was more than the roles others had imposed upon me. "You are not a burden," I wrote, "but the spine of a family that forgot how to stand." These words became a mantra, a source of strength in moments of doubt. The passage of time brought new rhythms and new relationships. A young volunteer from the local community center began visiting regularly, helping me with errands and sharing stories that bridged generations. His presence was a gentle reminder that life continued beyond the pain of the past, that connection and kindness could flourish in unexpected places. With his help, I navigated new technologies, staying connected to the world in ways that had once seemed daunting. Though I had reclaimed my dignity and forged a new path, the question of family remained complex and unresolved. There were days when I wondered if reconciliation was possible, if the fractures could ever heal. I understood that healing is a slow and delicate process, one that requires time, humility, and willingness from all sides. I held the door open, not with expectation but with hope. Hope that someday, in whatever form, understanding might come. In quiet moments, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here, the betrayals, the losses, the battles fought not just in courtrooms, but within my own heart. I saw now that the pain had shaped me but not defined me, that the strength I had found was not just about resistance, but about grace and acceptance. I had learned that to reclaim one's life is to embrace both the scars and the beauty, to hold both sorrow and joy in the same hand. And so, in the calm of this new chapter, I find myself able to offer a message to others who may walk a similar path. To women who feel unseen, unheard, or undervalued in their own families, I say this: your worth is not measured by the acceptance of others, but by the love you hold for yourself. There is strength in standing firm, in claiming your voice, and in choosing the life that honors your dignity. You are not alone, and even in the darkest times, there is a path toward peace. The resolution of my story is not a neatly tied ending, but a living, breathing continuation of a life reclaimed. It is the quiet assurance that though the chapters of pain and struggle may linger, they do not have the final word. There is always room for new beginnings, for healing, and for the gentle unfolding of grace. As I sit by my window, watching the sun set over the city, I feel a deep sense of gratitude for the strength I found within, for the friendships that sustained me, and for the life I continue to build on my own terms. The journey has been long and hard, but it has brought me to a place of quiet power and peace. And in that peace, I am home.